Welcome to Purple Octopus. From House Studios, this is a show for discovering wholeness in a fractured world.
I'm John Buck, Decision Maker.
I'm Karen Gimnig, Relating.
I'm Lauren Golden, Developing Humans.
And I'm Francois Nukel, Paradigm Shifting.
Today we have authors Yana, Ludwig, and Karen Gimnig to talk about their upcoming book, The Cooperative Culture Handbook. Yana is a cooperative culture trainer and consultant and longtime activist. Karen is a facilitator and relationship trainer who met Yana through their work with co-housing and intentional communities. So let me just hand it over to the two of you.
Great.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. So I'm Yana, and I'm going to go ahead and start with just a little bit of background on how this book project came about. At the tail end of 2016, I was working on my last book, which is called Together Resilient, Building Community in the Age of Climate Disruption. And that book was very focused on locally self-determined and self-governed responses to the climate crisis. And one of the things that started happening as I was doing the writing was that the section on human relationships and culture kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until the point that it was really out of whack with the rest of the book. And so I went and had a conversation with my publisher and editor, and we basically just decided, like, it seems like this is another book. And that book is one that's really intended to be more of like a handbook and a how-to for organizations and individuals to be making culture changes, both in terms of internal consciousness and also, in terms of how our groups operate. But the project languished a bit until last fall when Karen was out visiting my community that I live in now, and we got in some really interesting conversations, and it felt like Karen was the right person for me to pick that up with again, and that actually doing the project collaboratively seems much more appropriate to the content of the book. So that is how we landed here.
Yeah, it was a stroke of luck that I happened by at the right time, and there was this moment. So one of the frames that I think we're sharing in this, Yana and I both work a lot with communities that have this strong intention to be cooperative, to be collaborative, and whether that's co-housing or intentional community. Yana does a lot of work around co-ops. I'm doing some work with the agile software world, and I've done work with sociocracy, consensus, all those things. What we find is that there are an awful lot of structures in the world that are attempting to move toward this collaborative space, and people adopt those structures, and when those adoptions fail, we think that almost always the reason they fail is because there's an underlying cultural relational piece that needs to be built in order for those structures to really do what they're intended to do. And there's not a lot out there. I mean, there is a lot in some ways, but there's not this sort of really handy handbook that you can go to and say, this is how we're going to build this culture, and here's how to do an exercise in a meeting, or here's how to do a thing. So that really is why we thought, let's put a handbook together, a really hands-on, user-friendly, how to build this kind of culture shift into your organization, whatever that organization may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would also say that a lot of people's work have the kind of cultural pieces sort of embedded in them or implied by them, but one of the things that we're doing is really sort of teasing those pieces out and trying to break down, like, what do we mean by current mainstream culture? What do we mean by cooperative and collaborative culture that we want to be moving towards? So there's that sort of other layer of what we're doing with the book as well. And I think the other thing that has sort of motivated it for me is that, I got into doing groups dynamics work originally because I was seeing group after group fail, and that a lot of those were social change organizations, environmental organizations that I was a part of, women's groups that I was a part of. And so for me, there's the application to our community groups, but then there's also these much bigger, cultural level implications to doing this kind of work. And so I'm interested in having this be, building change within discrete organizations, but also changing people's consciousness that's going to have ripples out into that wider culture. And one of the critical pieces for me about that wider culture stuff is that I think, you know, in the United States, for instance, I think that we have a pretty serious issue with reaching for violence as a problem-solving tool. And whether that's in domestic violence situations, or that's in like verbal violence that plays out within our organizations, or it's police violence, or it's even like the United States being one of the most militaristic countries in the world. Like, I think it's at many, many, many different levels. And I think part of the problem is like, we haven't been taught anything about how to resolve conflicts and how to make decisions in a way that doesn't have some sort of inherent violence in it. And obviously, you know, because my last book was about climate disruption, like I think there's also really big implications for being able to do deep work on some of the most pressing issues that we have. And one of the focuses of Together Resilient was sort of breaking down, you know, when people are sharing resources and when people are operating in cooperative communities, their carbon footprints go down. And there's a really strong relationship between individualism and having really high ecological footprints. And so one of my hopes with this as well is that this is also going to ripple back out with that other book that I wrote last time, and sort of give people ways to be actually, you know, better actualizing the things that I was talking about in Together Resilient. And for me, like, climate is definitely one of the biggest motivations for everything I do. Actually, not just this, but everything that I'm involved in right now. But,
yeah. So we've spent some time really thinking about, okay, so if we're going to give groups these tools, what do they need to make that successful? And we're really laying out the book to be sort of, there's sort of two things happening together. So one is trying to give them some sort of facilitation methods and exercises and skill sets that they can use with groups that can be that, how do you work through conflict thing, or how do you make a decision together, or how do you run a meeting type stuff. And also wanting to give people ways to really do the deep work around culture shift, ways to really name out loud, these are the beliefs I was raised with, these are the things that I don't even realize I'm thinking about, but they're still determining my behavior. And I can now think about them, get conscious of them, and shift them. And so what we decided to do was sort of create this handbook series of activities, and each piece has a sort of theory piece. This is a thing that we think happens, that's what the mainstream culture is like and what we want to aim for, and this is sort of our vision of what the world can be when we get more collaborative. So there's a small theory piece. We don't want it to be a heavy read or we're not making a tome.
like a few paragraphs kind of thing.
But where you can kind of get your teeth into it, and then to suggest an exercise, some self-assessment pieces. And then the other piece, in addition to sort of those formal, like what you do in a big meeting facilitated, we think that just sitting with others and listening and thoughtfully listening and processing with one another, or potentially even doing that same kind of processing through a journal as an individual, but then having some prompts to work through using the listening tools that are my background from the Imago work that I've done, building that into each section. So each section has sort of a large group exercise with a skill set associated, and then a processing set of prompts that we'll recommend using that dialogue tool or journaling tool with. And there will be 20, 25 of those by the time we're done. And so each of those exercises could be applied to whatever content you're working on that week in your community, but also can be applied to doing this culture shift work very intentionally. So what we thought we would do as sort of the last piece of our little presentation today is that Yana's going to take us through one of those, just sort of the highlights of an example of what that looks like.
Yeah, cool. And we have like 22 or 23 of these sections at this point. And so one of those sections is talking about how like mainstream culture relates to differences, and that often it's like differences are experienced as a threat, whether that's a threat to us individually or a threat to some organization that we're a part of. There's a lot of resistance to differences actually getting like fully integrated in, and not just accepted, but seen as being interesting and valuable in our organizational work. And you know, there's lots of examples about how this plays out. I mean, it's everything from, you know, individuals like shunning people or just like avoiding people who are different, you know, and then crossing that line sometimes into actual violence against other people. And so that's sort of like the state of the mainstream culture right now. And those dynamics also have echoes into our meetings and into our group culture. And it plays out in ways like, you know, oftentimes if I say something in a meeting and then somebody says something that's different, even if they're not disagreeing with me, there's this internal reaction that often kicks in of like, oh, wait, but now you're threatening me in some way, like you didn't hear what I said, or I'm not going to get my needs met because this other person has something different going on. And so even when we're not in actual disagreement or conflict with each other, we often have patterned responses as if that's what's happening, even when it's just that someone's coming from a different background or has a different perspective on something, or just has a different need that could also be getting taken into account in terms of the decision making. And so, you know, this little section of the book is really about, you know, instead of like sort of pushing back when there are differences in the space, actually like leaning in with curiosity and being able to see differences as being interesting and differences as being enhancing for our groups, because often somebody from a different cultural background also has different skills or has different perspectives, and we lose out on a lot of that. And so for me, there's a big social justice piece to this particular chunk of being able to have our organizations be more racially diverse, more class diverse, you know, diverse in terms of philosophy, as long as it's within, you know, the parameters of whatever our group purpose is, that we actually want to sort of maximize diversity within those parameters. And so one of the exercises that's in this particular piece is one that I developed. So I'm on the board of directors of a national nonprofit called the Foundation for Intentional Community. And about 5 years ago, we realized that, I mean, we had known for a while, but we sort of got serious about wanting to change the fact that the organization was at that point and had almost always been almost entirely white. And so we started doing some internal looking at, like, what does that mean? And how did that get set up? And what are we doing to perpetuate that? And are we really the open door that we think we are? And so this was an exercise that I actually developed for us to do some sort of pre-work before we got into that heavy group analysis, and it's called 8-minute life stories. And so basically what you're doing is you're asking everybody in the group, and you just do it as a go around, and you tell people ahead of time so they have a little time to prep it, but you say, I want you to tell your life story through the lens of, and in this case it was race. And so we had a group of white people who most of us had never really thought about what does it mean to have a race and how does that affect our lives. And so that's just an example of like one of the kinds of exercises that we're putting in this, which is, you know, it's both like an internal exploration process, but it also laid the foundation for us to have like a much less judgmental and more open conversation about like, so what do all of those trajectories that we just described last night mean this morning for this conversation about, all right, how are we going to shift an organizational culture? Yeah, so that's an example.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're doing throughout the book is like that example. So she talked about it in terms of race, but you can use exactly that exercise to talk about, tell your life story as it relates to wealth, or as it relates to geography, or as it relates to, you know, environmentalism, or whatever might be live for your group at that moment. So that application beyond, here's one way to do it, and to apply it beyond. So.
All right, and I think that's what we wanted to share initially, is just like a little glimpse into what we're doing with this project. So I'm going to turn it back over to John for you to take it from here.
Great, thank you. From here, I'd like to go into our usual response round. So let's go to Lorene first.
Thank you, John. And Yana and Karen, thank you for sharing. I love what you're creating. So the first thing I'd want to just like lean into and amplify is, because I just had a conversation with someone this morning about it, but like the tendency of groups and even democracies to kind of collapse in on themselves, like that look for agreement and sameness. And Mickey Cashdan is someone that is a mentor, and she talks about coercive conformity, but that that pressure, and it's a coercive pressure to conform, and like sometimes it's explicit and oftentimes it's just implicit. So I just think having it named and be aware of it is helpful. And then I just think from, you know, through the lens of human development, I'm just thinking about the ways from when we are young, like how how this gets introduced, and just how differences are held and received, within families, within schools. But, we educate for, we were looking for so long for a single right answer, that's that thing versus multiplicity and pluralism and diversity of thought and embracing it. So I just, from that lens, there's not a lot that we can draw from. So just, again, having it in consciousness and choice, I appreciate this book. Thank you.
Francois.
You're muted, Francois.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for that. It was really interesting. I really appreciated that. And my understanding is that it's largely a workbook. A series of workbooks that will help groups, or mainly groups is my understanding, and or large and small, to really explore different things that are either impeding or helping cooperation and cooperation, which I think is very important. And really to generate the kinds, the exercise to generate the kind of conversations that are really required to be able to do that, to take people beyond their specialty. I used to be a cross-cultural trainer, so helping organization deal with cultural differences, in this case geographical cultural differences around the world. And you can't, it's the kind of thing you can't really talk about. It's all about awareness, and it's not things you can talk about. It's only things you can experience, and from the experience talk about them, talk about the experience and so on. So a lot of the work was very much in a very similar sort of line, of setting up situations, setting up either exercises or particular situations where people actually experience, go through the experience of those differences, can put themselves in a different mindset, and then drawing out the key learning points they got from that, which is something, because the natural response in most cross-cultural situations is not that. The natural response is normally to say us and them, and we have all a lot of that all over the world all the time, and so I can really appreciate what you're trying to do there, and I think it's very important, very useful. And I have my own theories as to why implementing some of those structures fail, but I'm not going to get into that. But I just want to mention I do have my own view as to why a lot of these things fail in the first place. But the essence of your book, as I understand it, is not about the failure, but as what to do about it, and how to take it forward. So I really love that. So thank you. Done.
Thanks, Francois. I really picked up on your phrase about talking about cooperative cultures versus individualistic cultures. And it reminds me of what a friend of mine from India told me. He said that when he was 18, he found out what day he was born for the first time. And he only found that out because he had to go fill out some state paperwork. He said they had a very cooperative culture, and that they really had the ceremonies. They didn't have birthday parties, but they had ceremonies that focused on the village and the village itself. And so, if you really want a cooperative culture, you might want to try telling everybody that they might as well forget their birthdays. We're not going to be individualistic anymore, or something like that. It's that fundamental of a thing that we're dealing with here. because we have a very individualistic culture. And I just wonder if people, as they go into this, really grasp what that means to be shifting a culture at that deeper level. Is that something we want to do? And is there a hybrid of both, and so on and so forth? And what are the pluses and minuses of that collaborative, non-individualistic culture? So I think that it would be interesting to know what the markers were of the culture as it shifts from highly individualistic to more cooperative. What are the symptoms, the signs that show up, and ways that groups can measure how they're coming in that cultural shift, or if they even know where they're headed to. So those were some of the thoughts that came up when I was listening to you. So yeah, if we can continue the round now to Karen, look forward to what our thoughts may have stimulated in your thinking.
Yeah, a lot of what I'm thinking is how fun it is to have my crowds together, right? Because there's so much similarity, and I know all of you so well, so it's just a joy to bring Yana into this. And I think that, John, what you're pointing to for group, yeah, like I think groups mostly don't realize that part of what's going to happen, like we're going to go live in this group together, or we're going to, adopt this collaborative software development method, or we're going to be a worker-owned co-op together, or whatever, that we're going to do this thing together. And it's going to have all these benefits for us. And I think very few groups really know how much shift in their own sort of belief system, how much that's going to be sort of challenged, and how much growth potential, like people talk about, the most expensive personal growth workshop you'll ever do with some of these. And I had one friend who was a senior guy who I think of as having probably been very communitarian and collaborative his whole life, moved into co-housing at retirement or around retirement without, just thinking it would be a really great way to live. And in retrospect said it's the most personal growth he'd experienced since the Peace Corps, which is saying something, I think. And I think that happens to a lot of us. And I think the communities that are really successful, or the teams that are really successful, are the ones that embrace some of that. And I think that's part of what we're inviting, is a shift in mindset that says it's not just the bringing on of a new structure that solves all of our problems, but as you pointed to, there are other pieces that have to be in play, and they are these relational skills. And then I think the place where Yana and I really align is that I think that interpersonal work that happens because I don't have a choice but do it if I want to stay connected to these other people I'm trying to be connected with. We don't raise our hand for conflict and personal growth. Nobody does personal growth because it's a good idea, right? We do personal growth because there is some pain point in our life that makes us do it. And when we try to be collaborative, we hit those pain points. And in the end, become much richer in all kinds of ways for having done it. But I do think that having a handbook like this that can sort of point out these are the pieces, and that can give us a chance to look at how are we doing on that one, and how are we doing on this one. And that's why we're including kind of a self-assessment, mostly just a list of questions, but a frame for what is this looking like if we're doing it well, so that folks can go, and we're imagining that people won't read the book from page 1 to page whatever, but that they'll pull out the pieces that make sense for them at, where that person or where that community is at that moment, and use it over years, I think is our hope. Mm-hmm. So that's what's coming up for me, hearing from all of you.
Yana.
Oh my gosh, I want to say 17,000 things at the moment. The one that I feel like draws together what a lot of you are saying is that this is absolutely lifelong work. Like, this isn't some instant thing. I mean, we have been trained how to be incredibly good competitors for our entire lives, and how to like sort of shut out differences. I think about in American schools anyway, it's a very common practice to give us these little worksheets that are like, here's 3 apples and an orange, cross out the one that doesn't belong. It's like we get indoctrinated from the time we can talk. about, you know, how to do this thing in a certain way. And then I think, like Karen's pointing to, like when we get into groups with cooperative intentions, like our intentions hit that buzzsaw of that, you know, lifelong cultural indoctrination almost immediately, and that people with really good intentions don't know how to get out of those situations. And so I think that's a lot of the motivation. And it's been really fun. I developed the original chart that we've been sort of working with and expanding as I was writing together Resilient. And since then, you know, so for the last like 3.5 years or so, I've been regularly doing cooperative culture workshops with groups. And I have people actually, like, we walk through the whole chart, and then I have people do some sort of self-assessment with it. And I hold up my version of that self-assessment. And I'm like, so I've been in community for 23 years. I've been doing this professionally for 15 years. I made the damn chart, and I am all over the map in terms of how I actually show up in my life with this. And so, you know, I think it's really important to be coming at this with like some degree of humility, that like all of us are on this journey together of like learning how to actually be cooperative and collaborative. And you know, the United States is, you know, according to, I don't know if you know the Hofstede indexes or indices, if we're going to say it really technically correctly. So Hofstede was an anthropologist who did a bunch of work on different cultures, and, you know, had a bunch of spectrums. And like one of those is individualism and collectivism. And the United States is the most individualistic culture in the world. We narrowly beat out Australia for that win. It's like, yay, we're number one. But that's actually not that great, you know, a lot of ways, you know, when we're trying to do cooperative stuff. And the other piece that I want to say is that there's actually 3 columns on the chart that we're working with. And one of them is the sort of, you know, what I call extreme competitive culture, which is, you know, sort of, you know, US mainstream culture. But then there's this swing all the way over to the other side, where you get into a lot of, you know, individual differences not being valued in the, like the sort of coercive part that Lorraine was talking about of, you know, groups trying to make everybody the same. And, you know, and a lot of martyrdom and a lot of like weird narcissistic emotional stuff that comes out of play when you like swing so much to that other extreme. And what we're actually talking about in this book is like, what is that middle and that balanced ground? Because, you know, humans are both individualistic and cooperative animals, like in our brain structure. And so, you know, finding like, so where is that point where, you know, it's not just about consensus, but it's about consensus with discernment. And, you know, there's like a whole bunch of things about like effective action rather than just let's all be, you know, rainbows and sunshine, because we all know that doesn't actually work functionally. And there is a lot of coercion and not a lot of consent actually in that like more extreme cooperative culture. And so really trying to find that balance point between those things. Okay, so that was 17 of the 27,000 things I want to say, but I'll stop.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. Let me just check and see if anybody has any final comments before we end for today. Lorraine.
So this is not a second round. This is just any comments.
It's a short round. Any comments that you have?
I think what I would just want to say, like, that I'm really hearing is around the both and like Yana, in your last comment, like John, it was in yours, and Yana, I really feel like you amplified that, but like, it's not about pendulum swinging to, you know, I think you're talking about the extreme nature of competition, and like, but an extreme nature of cooperation is still extreme. And so, yeah, how do you play the both and like try to get the upsides of both? And that's an uncharted territory with lots of potential. So excited. Thank you.
Thank you. Francois, any final thoughts? You're on mute.
Just realized, yeah. Yeah, so there are so many hidden, unspoken assumptions that we have. And that's the core of the problem. It's like the fish out of water. It's only when you get out of the water do you realize you live in water as a fish. And likewise, there are so many things we just take for granted. Well, we don't even realize that we have them as assumptions. And it's only when you're knocked out of them that suddenly you become aware that they're not a God-given or either cultural or in some cases it might be biological, but they're not. They're assumptions, and so in many cases, in many ways, addressing the cooperation, and the communication, and all of those things, requires us to also look at those assumptions, or those hidden assumptions, to bring those out and to come face to face with them. And my sense, without having seen the book, is that that's what you're trying to do. So I think that's very, very important work. I'm also very pleased that you're familiar with Hofstede. Final comment.
And from my standpoint, I'm looking forward to maybe at another time talking about what are the children like who grow up in these intentional communities where there's a both and culture. It would be fascinating to see what we're producing. And Karen and Yana, any wrap-up thoughts?
Well, the first on what you just said, John, I think what the children turn out to be is one of the key elements. And I recently was visiting a community where their teenager had gone off into the mainstream world to some, wilderness camping weekend, and came back and said, "Man, they really can't make decisions." And I think that although, yes, we may be subjecting them to a certain amount of pain as they have to go back out into the world that doesn't know how to do this yet, sending folks, whether they're children or at any age, back out into the broader world equipped with these skills is the most important reason to do this work.
I can also add a story from my own son. So my son is now 22, and when he came back from his first semester of college, he had two big observations for me about the world out there. One was, he said, "So I'm getting it, Mom, that we actually eat real food." It's like, that was cool. But the other one is more on topic with this. He said, "I just don't understand why when people have to spend an entire semester interacting with each other," which was a very long time when you're 16 years old, an entire semester, why they don't work their shit out with each other. And so, he had come out of this, community setting where it's like it was just a normal thing for us to work our stuff out. And he went out into that world, and he sort of hit that buzzsaw in the other direction, where it was like, oh my God, people don't do this. They don't talk about stuff. They don't show up for each other in any kind of conflict resolution. So that's my answer. Also, one other quick story that relates to a story John was just telling. My first husband was a yoga monk, and he had several teachers from India. And one of his Indian teachers used to say that the problem with Americans is that you think you have to figure it all out on your own. And I feel like, as much as anything else, that's kind of the heart of this book, is like hey, let's not actually figure this out alone. And here's a contribution to us figuring this out collectively. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On that, thank you everybody for your wonderful comments, your insightful comments. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. This has been Both And. So long till next time.